And I was standing at the start line having a panic attack, going, I can't do this. What the hell was I thinking? I can't run, and Mum coming and grabbing me and giving me a big hug and calming me down as mums do, and going, you don't have to run 2,250 today. You just have to go right now, take that first step and head towards that power pole up there, is exactly what she said. Get through the first half an hour, don't think about the rest. And that's been some of the greatest advice I've ever had. And I use that with her rehabilitation. I don't have to get her back to 100% today. I just have to keep her alive and moving forward, and taking that next thing on the list to do, that next training session. That's what I have to do right now. And that approach, and then getting up when like there were times when I was just absolutely despairing, and months where there's no progress, and I'd be coming home, I'd be bawling my eyes out, I'd be, my poor husband's shoulder got very wet very often, it was me crying away on his shoulder, but I would always get up the next morning and carry on. And that is what life's about. Get up again and go again, take another step.
Welcome to the To Be Human podcast, Lisa Tamati.
It's wonderful to be here. Thank you, Jennah-Louise. Thanks for having me. It's a real honour.
Yeah, you're very welcome. It's an honour for me as well. So I would love to start this conversation with a quote from your book, Running to Extremes. And it says, I think better when I'm running. My soul is at its quietest when I'm in the movement. So I'd love to start with some insight, Lisa, into your soul's journey of self-discovery.
Oh, wow. That's a really, did I really write that? That sounds very philosophical.
Profound.
Very profound. Yes, I'm very profound. To that quote, like the more I move, the better I feel. And that's partly because I now study genetics, and I understand why that's so important for my particular set of genes. I have a lot of stress hormones, adrenaline and cortisol. So for me, being in movement is very, very important. And when I'm in movement, I do think clearer. The mental chatter, the chatter that we have in our brains that's going sort of nonstop, it quietens down, and I'm able to focus myself, and it acts like doing sort of long distance running and just being out in nature. Really, it acts as an incubation period for all the creative work I do, or the intellectual work I do, or any problems that I'm going through. It sort of really helps me sort of churn through all that and come out the other side with my own sometimes eureka moments when I've been running, or like, oh, I have to write that down moments, or it's just giving the brain time and space, which I think in our day and age, where we're so, you've got 5 minutes, what are you doing in it? Like it's very much regimented as to high performance going all the time. And it's really, really important for the human mind, I think, to have space in the visual field, space also in the internal, in your internal, in your mind, and being in movement. And for me, in nature, that combines that so beautifully. So yeah, that quote is definitely how I live my life, really.
And from what I'm aware, you got into more of the endurance side of running in your late 20s, but obviously it wasn't always the case. So before this, did you find that, like you're sort of talking about this like quietness and this self-discovery, did you feel like you sort of, obviously you knew yourself less before this journey, but was it kind of like a really big transition between like you understanding who you are when you sort of went into the more endurance side of things?
I think, yeah, you're right. So just to give the listeners a little bit of background, so I've been an ultra marathon runner for 25 years now, retired from the long distance stuff, by the way. But I did get to spend, many, many years traveling the world and doing sort of extreme endurance events all over the place, from the Sahara to the Gobi to Death Valley to Australia to all over. And had some wonderful sort of revelations in this time. And the funny thing is I'm not a talented runner, and I'm still not a talented runner, and I'm not fast. One of the reasons I went long was because I didn't have, I was an asthmatic as a child. And I don't have a very good V2 max to this day. So it's you're sort of born with either genetic gifts, for things like endurance and speed and all those things. Well, I didn't have any of that. But what I did have was a very determined mindset and a love of adventure and a love of nature. And so you're right, I didn't get into running the longest stuff until my late 20s. And I had spent many years, like I cycled around many countries, cycle touring and trekking and climbing mountains and kayaking and crossing deserts on foot and things like that. So I didn't, come into ultramarathon running without any sort of sporting background. But, I remember doing my very first ultramarathon, which was a 240K across the Moroccan Sahara. This was a fantastic race called the Marathon des Sables, which is very famous. And that was just like, wow, this is just amazing. And, I just loved it. And so that's what got me hooked onto it. And I mean, I've forgotten what your original question is now, but just to give you the listeners a little bit of background. Yeah. And so, but as far as talent goes and abilities, I still just to this day don't have it. You put me in a local 10-kilometer run and I'll be in the middle of the pack somewhere. But I found that I had a really good ability to go long, so I could run hundreds of kilometers, and I'd sort of outstand most people. That's the thing. I'd just still be going when most people had quit, and that was my only redeeming feature, really. So sorry, Jennah-Louise, I completely went off topic there, and I can't even remember the original question.
No, we love that. The more important stuff always comes out.
Exactly. Yeah. That's right.
So I guess what I was sort of curious about is because I read all 3 of your books, which
wow,
thank you. It was a beautiful, beautiful journey to go on. I really noticed, like as a reader, that from the first book to the 3rd book, you really got a strong sense of self. And it seemed the earlier stories, you were still kind of figuring out who you were and what self-worth was, what self-confidence was, what your standards were. And it was almost like I watched you throughout sort of your journey really get a sense of who you are and really stick by that. But it hadn't always been that way.
Oh, yeah, you are so right. And it's so beautifully, actually, I don't think anyone's actually read all 3 of them in a close proximity to each other, because they came out quite, like you've just done, and then asked me that question. So I evolved as a person just immensely in that time, as you do, my early stuff was, in my 20s, and then now I'm in my 50s. So, there's a lot of evolution going on. And in my early life, and you would know the story from the first book, Running Hot, where I was in a very abusive relationship for a number of years in my early 20s, and that really shaped me in a lot of ways, some good and some bad. I was with a guy who, had a lot of issues, and, I don't want to, it's a long time ago and things like that, but it was very detrimental to my self-confidence and who I was when you're being constantly told that you're hopeless and that you're useless. And this guy was an extremely good athlete, and he had very, very high standards for himself and for me. And we would, we spent all this time together traveling the world and constantly pushing the limits of, endurance, certainly my limits. And doing this in a way and being told all the time that you're not good at it and that you're hopeless, and why can't you go better and go longer and go harder and better, faster? That slowly rubs you down over time, and you start to break down as far as your self-belief and your confidence. Because I'd grown up in a very loving family. My mum was just the most wonderful mum, and my dad was awesome, but he was also a very tough man. And so I think I transferred a lot of wanting to please my dad stuff from childhood, because he wanted, us to be tough, and he wanted us to represent New Zealand in sports and be the best at everything. He's one of these great, push your kids hard type things out of love. But it was also a lot of pressure for a young kid. And and I was a very sensitive child, and I think I just, the way I reacted to that was always wanting to please my dad, and then always wanting to please the boyfriend, and then losing who I was in between. And so I was with this guy for 5 years, and that really, by the time we did end up parting, it was, I was in a bad way. He actually left me while crossing the Libyan desert. You know the story, don't you, Jennah-Louise? Which was an illegal crossing of the Libyan desert under very extreme circumstances, 5-year relationship, and he leaves me in the middle of it, literally abandons me with 2 other guys, but he left. And so that was a pretty extreme moment in my life. As you can imagine, we didn't have enough water. We didn't know whether we were going to survive. I didn't know whether he was going to get out, and he leaves me. So that was a turning point in my life. And you really have to read the book to get the whole of that story. It was pretty dramatic. Took me a couple of years to recover physically, and certainly a lot longer mentally to recover from that. And this is where running really saved me. I want to say it saved my life. I was in such a bad space after that. I was burnt out. I was physically not well. I was mentally very unwell. I was suicidal. Confidence was zero. All of these things, and slowly but surely, by getting into my running, and doing that first ultramarathon that I just spoke about, the Marathon des Sables, that was a really positive turning point. That was like, I wanted to continue doing adventures, but in a bit more of a controlled environment. And I was all of a sudden in the ultramarathon world surrounded by positive, go forward people who were facing big challenges. And it was a very supportive community. And I found that just the combination of pushing yourself hard physically, but being in a supportive environment, just such a revolution for me. And it really changed my perception of what I was capable of. And I ended up realizing I wasn't too bad at this really long stuff, because I just, I had developed a lot of mental toughness, if you like, the ability to push through pain, the ability to go for, hours and even days on end, and push through boundaries. So I had learned that with the boyfriend, and then to actually get a lot of encouragement in these positive sort of environments was a lethal combination in a way, because then it made me just addicted to one event after the other, because I just wanted more of that, please. and the rest is history. So 140 ultramarathons later, lots of highs and lows along the way. But you're very right, I grew a lot in that time.
I'm sure you would over 140 ultramarathons. Did you have because we're talking about those defining moments, those pivotal moments. Did you have a moment throughout those 140 ultramarathons where it kind of transitioned or transformed between you kind of going out and proving to others that I can do this, which obviously kind of came from your previous relationships and growing up and trying to impress your father, to a moment where you're okay, now I'm sort of doing it for myself and proving to myself?
Yeah, definitely. And actually, I think in the last probably, I'd like to say, so from the age of about 39, 40 is when things really changed. It took that long. I'm a slow learner, slow developer. Up until that point, it was very much, and I'd also gone through another, a divorce actually at the age of 38, when I lost everything. I lost the country I was living in, because I was in Austria, married to an Austrian, went through a marriage breakup, and had to come back home to New Zealand. So I lost my business, my house, my country, my husband, all at once. And that was another really deep turning point in my life. And I came back to New Zealand with nothing, financially nothing, and just a complete mess of a life, really. And again, running rebuilt me. And so I think I had a goal when I came back. I got into a race called the Badwater Ultramarathon, which is another really famous race. And at that point, I was completely broken. I didn't know which way was up. But I had qualified for this race. And this has been something on my radar for a long time, because it's a bit like, it's an unofficial world of champs of our sport. It's like Kona is for the, triathletes or something. So it was really special to get in this race. And so when I came back to New Zealand, and I qualified for this, I got a spot in it, and then I had, well, how the hell am I going to get there? I got no money, I got no means to do it. So I started talking to people and sponsorship and learning to market myself, learning to speak, learning to put sponsorship proposals together, learning to do all of these things. And I had wonderful support in my hometown, and different companies that came, and friends and people that became friends, that stepped up and became my crew, became sponsors, invested in what I was doing and got the vision and came along for the ride. And that race was another huge turning point in my life, because I had a 2020 crew come and do a documentary on my race there. And that sort of, I got to, book deals and speaking engagements, and it sort of gave me a new career, if that makes sense, a new life. And again, started to rebuild, after. So if you can imagine, you've gone through your 20s, you've had this big breakup in your late 20s, and then I ended up marrying another Austrian, stayed over there, and then that sort of broke at 38. So you're just doing this roller coaster that life does sometimes throw at you, and you're having to rebuild and regrow and step back up again. And every time, running has been my go-to place, my safety place, really. And it's where I grow and I change, because when you're pushing outside and you're taking on big projects like this, and you learn so much along the way. It's not about running, running's boring to talk about and boring to watch, really, but it's the internal journey that you go on when you're taking on massive challenges, when you're pushing your limits, when you're learning to deal with adversity. It teaches you resilience, it teaches you discipline, it teaches you the ability to grind through thousands of hours of training. I was watching yesterday, off topic, but I was watching the Tour de France, which I love. I just love watching the Tour de France, because I've never been a cyclist in that sense of the word, as in a racing cyclist, but I just understand what those guys do to be there. And Chris Froome is, one of my favorite athletes. And he's had a massive accident a couple of years ago, and he's fought his way back. And yesterday he got hit, with a big fall. And, now I'm like waiting with bated breath to see whether he's going to continue today. And, and I watch someone like that, and I just think, man, that guy is so tough, so resilient. No matter what happens to him in life, he'll get back up again. And that's a really good lesson, I think, for business, for sport, for life events that come at you, is no matter what comes at you, you have the ability to get back up again and fight again and carry on and find ways around obstacles. And these have been some of the greatest learnings that I've taken away from ultramarathon running, for sure. Yeah.
And through ultramarathon running, what has been, I suppose, a fall that you've taken where you've got back up and you've been really proud of?
Oh my God, where do I start?
Every single one.
There have been some spectacular failures. So I remember, I was doing a race in Niger, which is like deep in the Sahara. It's a very, very poor country, very deep in the Sahara. So we're, not far from Timbuktu, literally. And there was a 333k race that my then husband and I had been training for a good 18 months. And this was, 333k's across one of the most dangerous countries that was in a civil war at the time. Very, very... And this race was dreadfully organised, which I found out later, when I got to the race. It wasn't like the other races that I'd been involved with to that point that were really good and well organised. It was only 17 runners that turned up, and, we didn't have everything we were meant to have. The food didn't arrive, et cetera, et cetera. It was just really crazy, really dangerous. And a week before I went to this race, my husband says he wants a divorce. So I'm like, you've got to be kidding me. Out of the blue, just completely left field. To me, it was left field. He'd met someone else. He wanted a divorce. That's what it was. And so I'm in this completely mucked up state, knowing that my life is about to turn upside down. Not only my marriage, but my country, my business. I had a successful jewelry business in Austria. I was going to lose everything. And and I'm facing this race, and I'm like, I can't pull out because we had obligations to sponsors, we had a film crew, we had, all this sort of thing going on. So I went down to this race in a really bad place, almost as bad as the places that I'd been in a decade earlier in the Libyan desert. I keep losing men in deserts. and to top it all off, he was an extremely talented ultramarathon runner, and he was winning the race, and I managed to get food poisoning on top of it all. So the night before, so the food that we'd meant to have come down from France with us in the plane didn't arrive. I don't know where it went, but it didn't arrive with us. And so we were left with local fare, which was basically a goat that they'd strapped to the Land Rover as we were driving out into the desert for 3 days. And that goat got cooked along the way, so to speak. And I partook of a goat stew the night before. And my ex-husband now, he didn't take that stew. Luckily, I did, and 5 other runners did as well. And all 5 of us got food poisoning. So, but it didn't start till about an hour into the race. So you're out in the middle of Sahara, you're facing down the barrel of 333 kilometers. You've got a divorce hanging over your head. You know your world's going to turn to shit anyway. You're in a really dangerous country. There's military convoys coming through this vast desert. It's just flat sand for as far as the eye can see. Military convoys coming through. They were doing oil exploration. There were fights going on with the local people. It was just like everything that could go wrong was going wrong. And then you're vomiting and have diarrhea and trying to run. It was a good time, I tell you. So that was really a drastic failure. I spent 64 hours fighting my way through. I got to 222 kilometers, and then I had to pull out at one of the checkpoints. There weren't many checkpoints, and there wasn't enough water even at the checkpoints, and it was just absolutely horrifically organized. And so I had to pull out, was the long and the short of it. And I was bleeding at both ends. I was in dire straits. I kept passing out, horrible. And I was just devastated that I'd failed, that I'd set out, because it was the first time I'd really failed quite that spectacularly, on a doco as well, and just all this emotional turmoil of going through a divorce. It was just all a bit much, really. And that's when I, came home to New Zealand and actually had qualified for that other race and had to rebuild my life in the next 6 months. But so that was a spectacular failure, and one that I beat myself up with for a long time, thinking you're useless, you failed, you didn't make it, blah, 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 blah. And now I'm like, are you kidding? You can be too hard on yourself sometimes. And no race is worth dying for. And, you are under extreme duress. Cut yourself some slack, for God's sake. Now looking back at it. But back then I wasn't. I was just like, you're useless, you're hopeless, you're never going to amount to anything. Look at the state of your life. You're a complete mess. Your husband doesn't want you. You're a useless athlete. What's the point of you being here, So all of those sorts of things going on in the back of your head. Yeah. So since then, though, it's all been, I've had more successes and more failures as far as the racing went, but nothing that blew me quite so to pieces as that time in my life. And then coming back to New Zealand and rebuilding my world was the best thing for me ever. Looking back with the value of hindsight, coming back into my country with that really supported me. My parents really supported me. All of the good things to be back in your own home country, and I'm glad that happened now, looking back. But yeah, it was a rough road at the time.
Yeah, I think we all throughout our life have a tendency to be really irrationally hard on ourselves. What was the switch for you? Because I feel like your story's it's a pretty brutal one. Like when you really try and feel what you went through, it's pretty intense. And for you to sort of short term look back at that feeling like you didn't do good enough, how far down the track from that experience did you realize actually that was a really heroic effort on my part?
Yeah, I think it took me a good 4 or 5 years, really, and a couple of other successes and failures later, and more experience in life, and realizing that running wasn't the be all and end all, and that I have a value as a person outside of being an ultra marathon runner. And now that I've retired, I remember going through another bit of a identity crisis. It's like, well, you've reached all these great, heights, if you like, in your sport, and you just, XYZ, you achieve this, you achieve that, and now you're not doing that anymore. Who the hell are you again? And struggling with that for a little while, and we'll get into why I gave up the ultra marathoning in a bit, but realizing that I have a value as a person, and that is independent of my achievements, that is independent of when we are not our occupation, we're not our profession, we're not our sport, we're that's parts of our lives, and that we have value just for who we are. And that took a long time, and it's still an evolving thing at times. I'll still look at other athletes who are still doing things and think, oh, well, I'm not doing that anymore, oh, woe was me. And then I'll pull myself together and, get on with it. And because I have other things to be doing right now, and those are more important, those missions. And understanding that. And I think when you have that really type A personality where you just want to be the best at everything and always going hard out with the foot to the floor all the time, you get away with that in your 20s and your 30s and into your 40s, but sooner or later the wheels are going to fall off, and they certainly have fallen off with me a number of times in a health sense and burnout sense and all that sort of things. So for me, it's understanding my body better, my mind better, how I operate, and how I can optimize who I am without killing myself in the process. And that is, but I think without going through these experiences, you don't get the benefit of ever getting to a position like this. If you just always sat in your comfort zone and you'd never pushed anything, you wouldn't have been through some of these most brutal experiences, but you also wouldn't have grown and become more mature and been able to understand and have empathy and all of these great skills that you now have because of those experiences.
And in being obviously you're a running coach, do you find many of the people that you coach come in with a very similar mindset of like attaching their identity and sense of self-worth to their achievements? And when they sort of don't achieve their goals and they sort of lose that, I guess, confidence and self-worth within themselves?
Yeah, very much so. And you get sort of two camps. You get the ones who haven't even, like, because we work with people who are just starting out. It's not just, we don't just work with elite athletes, because to be honest, I'm not that interested in the elite athletes, because they generally have the a lot of talent. And I love working with people who haven't got a lot of talent, who have normal daily struggles, who are mum with 3 kids and a career and still wants to run a marathon or a half marathon or lose 10 kilos and get fitter or whatever the case may be. And those are the people I love working with, because that's where I relate to, even though that I've from the outside, if you look at the statistics of what you did and where you went, people with, oh, you'll only work with but that's not what really interests me. I love dealing and helping with people who have got issues around self-confidence and self-belief, and I can help be that. I can help shortcut that process that I didn't have shortcuts for back then. And when I get alongside somebody and I believe that they say you come to me, you want to run a marathon and you've never done anything like this before, and I know where to start, and I know how to train you, I know the program that you'll need, and I say to you, look, we're going to get there. You just have to follow me, do what we set out for you, and us and our coaches set out for you. Follow the plan, trust in the process. You've got what it takes and you will get there. Then they're more likely to actually achieve that, because somebody that they think is an expert tells them they can. And that really brings up a really important point about people. When they believe something is possible, they are more likely to achieve it. It's not actually me, and it's not actually even the program. It's the belief that somebody believes in them, that they can achieve it. That's the key point. And this is where I'm very big on empowering people to take on big, impossible, scary, humongous goals and dreams, and then chunking it down so that it's a daily to-do list, but helping them reach for the stars, you know, and doing it in a proper manner. So you don't, you know, as a young coach, when I could take people and have them running, you know, I had one guy who ended up, after 3 weeks, we took him from half marathon to a 250K multi-day stage race, and he did it. And I was like, wow, that's what self-belief can do. But what I didn't understand is that his body wasn't prepared for that. He did it, but he busted himself in the process. And so, you know, I did him a disservice in a way, even though he achieved his incredible goals. I'd set an artificially inflated where he was actually in the process. For then it was for him hard to go back down and actually go through the proper process of building up. And so now I'm not big on that. I like people to go through the steps, even though I myself also did that. I hadn't even done a marathon when I ran a 240K. But that's not the right way to go about it, really, because you can bust people and they may have achieved that one goal, but you're very unlikely to see them ever again. And that's what you have to avoid. So you have to build them up to that strength. And there is a process to follow, and the body and the biology needs a certain amount of time to do this. And if you do the hard work, you'll get the results, especially now with all the knowledge that we have around genetics and stuff, you know, like back in the old days before we had, you know, gene testing and all this fantastic knowledge that we now have. I could train 2 people and get completely different results, and they had the same training plan, the same diet, even the same everything else, and they'd get completely different results. And the difference is I was training that person correctly for their genetics and that person incorrectly. Now that's a part of our coaching process, and that's part of what we do is health optimization and genetic testing, and we build that into our program so that we understand what your specific genes need in order to reach that level. And that means what types of exercise at what times of the day and which foods are the best for you, and all of this great information about your mood and behavior and your dominant hormones and your dominant neurotransmitters and how that plays out. All of this great information we never used to have, of course. I mean, you got to think, in the time when I started ultramarathoning, we didn't even have electrolytes, you know, we didn't know what electrolytes, we had some salt tablets, you know, that was it. We had no idea of anything. And to see this whole evolution of where we are now, as far as being able to dial in everything, you know, it's a pretty big evolution in one person's half a lifetime, you know, so it's pretty exciting.
Yeah, I find the mental versus the physical aspect of things really fascinating. I can relate to you. My first ultra marathon, I hadn't done a marathon myself, and I thought it was a great idea to go and run 350 kilometers over, I think it was like 7 or 8 days. And
oh man,
yeah, like from 4 months of deciding that I was going to now be a long distance runner, it was brutal.
Wow.
And I quit. It was yeah. Well,
I'm impressed you even thought of that. Yeah. That's amazing.
Well, that was very representative of my mental state in that time a few years ago. But I say that because when I decided to stop, I sort of said to myself, okay, like I'm going to go for a few more hours to truly know that like I've got nothing more in me. And I eventually stopped, and I had a really good, I think it's kind of like flowed in reflection for the next few years, is like truly understanding when is the right time to say no. Because I think, as you know, you and I, obviously, we very much identify with being very strong-minded and determined and resilient, all these amazing qualities. But in that moment, I realized that there's a cap to that. And then it starts really physically hurting you. How do you sort of like, obviously with yourself and with the people that you coach, where is the line for you on that?
Yeah, that's just brilliant. And you know, congratulations for having the courage to even take on something like that. And the fact that you didn't make it is, and you know, you learned, I bet, a ton in that process. And that, I talked to Commander Mark Devine. I had him on my podcast recently. He's a Navy SEAL, amazing guy, and he was saying, you know, there is no such thing as failure. There is only, you either made your goal, you won, you got there, brilliant, and if you didn't, well, awesome. Okay, what did you learn? You know, where was the growth here? There's no failing in that sense. You know, this is binary. Oh, you crossed the finish line. Oh, you didn't cross the finish line. It's a very man-made binary construction. But when you actually even take on such a big challenge, you had to go, okay, what do I have to do? How do I prepare? What gear do I need? What you taught yourself everything from scratch, basically, on how to actually get to this. The fact that you took on something quite so big so soon may have been, you know, if you are, you know, maybe with me, you would have maybe gone a little bit smaller for starters. But I understand that go big or go home mentality. And certainly, you know, I've done that and I've gotten through by the skin of my teeth a few times on things like that. But there's a very dangerous line, and I see lots of in the ultramarathon community, where you can push yourself till the point you die, you know, and I've seen people die, and I've come close to death myself, and I've seen others come close to it. I've seen people with permanent damage. I've seen, you know, and these are the things we don't generally talk about in the community, and it's not, you know, super common, but we need to have an understanding of the risks that we are taking when we do these things. I mean, you get your brain too hot and you can, you know, go beyond the point of no return very, very quickly into a coma and die. You get rhabdomyolysis and you can have very damaged kidneys. You know, there's many ways to die. In other words, you can get lost. You know, I remember running in Jordan, and it was 168 Ks non-stop, and through Jordan, a very dangerous place, again, in the desert, blah, blah, blah. Got surrounded by dogs one night, and was lost and couldn't find my way to the next checkpoint, and I'm running out of water, and I'm surrounded by, you know, wild dogs, and, you know, like, I'm just like terrified, you know, and I eventually found the checkpoint, and I got through by the skin of my teeth. So there are points where I think I pushed it too far, like in Niger. That was definitely a point that 222 Ks was already way too late. I should have pulled out way earlier. It's not worth dying for. We are not in a war. And I understand the mentality, well, you know, I want to be able to see if I could cope in any situation. That was always the thing for me. Like, humans throughout history have had to go up against survival situations all throughout their lives to stay alive, and that is baked into our DNA in a lot of ways. We want to be able to test who we are and what we're capable of, and I applaud that. But on the other hand, I don't want anyone that I'm coaching to die. I don't want to die. I want people to come home safely with having an incredible experience without putting their life and their health on the line. And therefore, I think these conversations in the ultramarathon circle are important to have, and to recognize the signs when things are going south, and to be able to, you know, maybe help people make the right call to pull out when it is time to pull out, because there are times when it's just not safe to continue. And it's a very fine line. I mean, I was watching, again, going back to Chris Froome last night after that fall, and watching him get up, and he was determined to finish. I don't know, I haven't heard any interviews or anything, but I just saw his whole body was shaking, and he had a couple of mates that were just escorting him in the last 5 Ks over the line. He could have had concussion, he could have broken bones, he could have any manner of things from that, but he's just so headstrong, mindset strong, that he just pushed through to give himself the chance to be able to get up the next day and to continue on the Tour de France, which is obviously a huge deal. And he's a professional, and that's his job. But when does it become dangerous, you know? And I wish him well, and I hope he is continuing, and he, you know, hasn't got any permanent damage, because God knows that guy deserves to get back. But yeah, it is a fine line, and as a coach, I'm trying to help people navigate that position. And you know, we're not at the race with the athlete. So, you know, you just don't hope that they'll be able to make good calls and have that knowledge that it's okay. And this is where wrapping support around people who do fail, to use the wrong terminology, but who don't make their goals, wrapping some support around them, just that, you know, comradeship of man, that's just awesome what you did. You have to put this in perspective, because in 5 years' time, it's not going to matter. That's my go-to thing. Like, whenever anything shit happens in my life, I go to, in 5 years' time, are you even going to remember this? Is this going to be important to you? And then if it's not, then don't make a big mountain out of it. You know, it will pass. It will pass. You know, there are certain things in life that won't pass. You know, when somebody dies or somebody, you know, some major things. Those are the things worth worrying about. Not whether you didn't get to compete or you didn't, you know, finish a race or whatever. It's not that important.
Yeah.
So well done. I'd love to hear your whole story.
Yeah, it was pretty wild. It was actually a really beautiful moment, because I think there was something deeper inside of me that was really seeking to do something that I reached my limits. I'd always done other things that I'd always completed. And I don't think I ever experienced in my lifetime something that I had to say no to. So there was something really beautiful in the growth of that. But in terms of goal setting, what I kind of realized is, like, my goal is always first and foremost to just give my best, and to understand that sometimes my best is not finishing, and to be really clear on that.
Wonderful. You're very wise, young lady. Wise beyond your years. Yeah. That's a really good approach, because, you know, when you're taking on big challenges, and this is, you know, whether it's a academic challenge, a business challenge, or whatever, job challenge, or sporting, you have to understand that when you're taking on big things, big impossible goals, that you're pushing up against the limits of what's possible, that you are reliant on other factors, you know, whether it's other people, other teams, finances, whatever the case may be in that situation, that you do not control. So you have to differentiate between the factors that you control, the factors that you semi-control, and then the factors that you have absolutely no control over. And then you have to make a plan and strategy, and you have to, you know, chunk it down from your long-term goals into your, you know, you have your big, hairy, scary goal that's out there, and then you have your midterm one and your shorter ones, and then you have your daily, you break it down in your to-do list today. And that's all very well and good, but you have to sort of understand that you're still going to get things coming out left field out of you, you know, at you. And those are the things, learning to be flexible on the fly. So when you're actually in an ultra marathon and all of a sudden your sugar levels drop and you start vomiting, you know, what do you do? And the more knowledge you have about how to care for your body, what to do, whether you should be pulling out, or actually, you know, you just need to sit down for 20 minutes and then you might be all right to continue on. It's having that knowledge, and that's where experience and things like that come in. But just understanding you do not control everything, even though you'd like to think so. And going back to Mark Divine, he's got so many great quotes, but he said, you know, the best laid plans sort of, you know, don't survive contact with the enemy, the first contact with the enemy. You know, as soon as you actually engage in the real fight or the real war or the real things or the real world, yeah, your plans, you better have plans, but those plans are going to go out the window. And then how adaptable, how flexible, how much can you change on the fly and keep going forward, I think is the biggest sort of key.
Which I think is very appropriate to what has been happening in your life the last few years. I know that you were sort of on one form of trajectory, and then sort of all of a sudden it's going in another way. Could you share with us what's been happening?
Yeah, thanks. It's so five years ago, I had a situation in my life, or 5.5. My mum had a massive aneurysm, and my mum is, you know, like been my rock of my world, most amazing mum can possibly imagine. And she's always sort of been that stability and that person, you know, and then so she collapsed at home and she was rushed up to hospital in the ambulance, and I got that phone call, you know, mum's collapsed, get up to the hospital. And on the way to the hospital, the ambulance driver thought she was having a stroke or a neurological event of some sort. And we got to the hospital, and he told the doctor as much. And the doctor decided to ignore it and said, "Oh no, she's just having a migraine." And so he just said, "I'll give her some painkillers and just, you know, watch her." And so I didn't know anything about anything at that point. You know, I didn't know anything about brain injuries or any, you know, what could happen. I had no idea of anything. And I had, you know, growing up with like most of us, the doctors know what they're doing. They're the ones that have been to medical school. They're the experts. So we'll leave it up to them, you know. And for hours this went on. My mum was in screaming pain. I'd seen her have migraines. She'd had many migraines over the years. She hadn't had one for a long time, but I knew what a migraine looked like in her, and this was no migraine. And so I knew there was something major wrong, but I didn't know what to ask for. So I got caught out, really. I had a friend who was a paramedic who worked up at the hospital. She was an ambulance, and she'd crewed for me on races and stuff, and she knew my mum very well. And so I said, can you get up here? I don't know what, but we need to, they're not listening to me, and they're ignoring me and telling me it's a migraine, and it's not. She came up and took one look at mum and said, oh, she's having a stroke or an aneurysm or something. And she went to the doctor and told him no uncertain terms and told him off basically and said, get her a CT scan now. After 6 hours, she's a very strong-willed lady, so he didn't deny her, thank goodness. So after 6 hours, we finally got a CT scan, and blood right throughout the brain was the result. Massive aneurysm had burst, and from that point on, they didn't think she was going to survive. And they decided to get her down to the neurological unit down in Wellington, which is 5 hours drive from where we live. And they called the air ambulance. And in this time, I'm like realizing that I've missed the boat. If I'd asked for that, if I'd stood up and fought for and known what to ask for, then we wouldn't be in quite such a desperate situation where she's dying. And now I had another 12-hour wait while the air ambulance came, because that's how long it took. And we finally got into surgery 1 o'clock in the morning, so 18 hours after this aneurysm had burst. So it's meant to be one of the worst pains in the world, because your skull is a fixed size, right? And you've got blood pouring into it, and your brain is being compressed and it's dying. And it's causing inflammation, and the pain is apparently horrific. Anyway, they get her into the surgery, they put a stent and start draining the blood off, but she's by no means out of the woods. For the next 21 days, there's a period of time where the blood and brain matter will still be interacting, causing inflammation, and it causes spasms in different parts of the brain, or it can do, and it can knock off different parts of the brain, basically. So in this time, I'm like, okay, I've been caught off guard here. I'm going to start researching, studying, and being hypervigilant in the medical system. I'm now realizing that, yeah, nobody's perfect and anybody can make mistakes, and there's limited resources, and you better fight for the resources, and you better know what you're asking for, and you better watch everything they do, because mistakes can be made. And so I started studying like everything I could. And of course, in this critical care situation, there wasn't a heck of a lot I could do, but I could watch and I could make sure that she was getting the best. After 3 days, they had to do another operation where they went up through the femoral artery and put in some coils to stop any more bleeding. In that operation, she had another stroke on the right-hand side, and so she was now paralyzed on the right-hand side, and then she started going in and out of coma and losing more and more of her brain as the time went on. And it got to a point one morning, I think it was about 4 or 5 days in, and I came in the morning to relieve my brother, who'd been looking after her for a couple of hours, and all the doctors are working on her, and it was that horrible scene where you think, this is it, she's dying. And there's about 10 of them working on her, and she'd gone into a deep coma, and so they had rushed her up into the ICU. And there I realized what level of care was available, and they hadn't had her in there because I don't know why, but this level is, well, it's expensive, I know why. Cost a lot of money to have someone in the ICU, but there they were able to give her drugs that they weren't able to in the neurological unit. So again, I'd missed the boat. I hadn't asked for, I hadn't pushed for, probably wouldn't have got it anyway, but if I'd known that sort of resource was available, so that made me even more hyper aware, because now she had 24/7 round the clock care with a nurse and doctors on call at all times in the station. And so the level of care that she got there, they managed to stabilize her, and she got through that critical window. When she stabilized, though, she had massive brain damage, and she was 74 years old. So she had no ability to control any bodily functions. She had no idea of who she was, what she was, basically like a baby, but in a woman's body. And she was then taken back to New Plymouth after a week or two. And once she'd stabilized and for rehabilitation. And in this time, I started to study everything I could. And I was noticing in her, because I was observing her for hours and just trying to work out what can I do? How can I be proactive? So I started to bring in good nutrition. So she was being put on something called Ensure, which is crap that they put people on. That's dreadful for brain injuries, shall we say. And so I had her on, like green smoothies, and she couldn't hardly eat anyway. So it was really hard to get stuff into her. And she could only basically eat tiny amounts at a time. She didn't know how to chew properly. She didn't know how to swallow properly. So it was all very difficult. But I picked up that I thought she had sleep apnea because she was sleeping 18, 20 hours a day, extremely fatigued. And I was seeing like infections in her mouth and things like that I'd experienced when I'd done altitude races and had altitude sickness. And I was thinking, she hasn't got enough oxygen in her body. I wonder if she's got sleep apnea. And so I asked the doctors if we could do a sleep apnea assessment, and they said, no, can't, why should we? What's no reason. And so I went and got an outside consultant. I brought them into the hospital one night, on the quiet when no one was looking. We did a sleep apnea assessment. You can imagine how popular I was up here. It came back severe sleep apnea. So she was knocking off brain cells as she was asleep. Like hundreds of times a night, she would stop breathing. Her oxygen stats were down at around 70%, which is incredibly low. And it meant that she was knocking off whatever brain cells she had. They were going south very quickly. She was chain state breathing. She wasn't going to live very long in a state like that. So that was my first big one, that we got her onto a CPAP machine, which would help her breathe at night. And then we sort of started to see tiny bits of improvement, not rushing. But then I was like, what else can oxygen do? And I heard about something called hyperbaric oxygen therapy. And this is where they use it in dive accidents, but they also use it for brain injuries overseas. They use it in New Zealand for things like diabetes and gangrene and diabetic wounds for speeding up the healing, but they don't use it for brain injury in New Zealand. But I studied Dr. Hart's work in America and realized this was something that really could help her brain recover some of the function. And so after 3 months in the hospital, they said to us, look, she's not ever going to do anything again. She's got massive brain damage. She's too old. Her brain won't adapt, blah, 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 blah. And I just went, no, that's bullshit. And I don't believe that. And you guys have been wrong before and you've missed things before. And I'm just, I didn't say that, but that's what I was thinking. I will see, I'm going to throw everything at this. I'm going to get her back or die trying, was the approach that I went into it. At that point, obviously, I stopped ultramarathon running at that point instantaneously because I had to focus on her rehabilitation. And so I had to really fight for some resources to take her home because they said, look, you have to put her in an institution. She's 24/7 round the clock care, 2 people at all times. You're never going to cope with her at home. And I had argument after argument with the social worker, and he was just going, you're not going to cope. He actually went behind my back because I was the advocate for the family. They were meant to go through me. Went to my father, who's, was elderly, very broken and very upset and, very, very fragile. And I was trying to protect him from having to make any of these big decisions and stuff. And they went to him when I wasn't there and tried to get him to sign the papers to put her in a home, put her in an institution. And my father's response was, well, if my wife is never coming home again, I don't want to live. And then he was suicidal, so I nearly lost my father at that point, which was just, that I wanted to punch this guy in the face, really. I was so angry because there was a reason that, I was the advocate, because my father was just, it's just the love of his life. He didn't want to be without her. And all of these aspects. And that was another reason to take her home. I knew nobody could care for her like we could. And if we were going to go down, we're going to go down fighting. We're not going to go down just, and it was so important for my dad to have her at home as well. And I thought, she needs to be surrounded by her family and her things, and she will know on some level that she is in the bosom of her family, that she is, loved. If I stick her in an institution, on some level, she's going to know that. And that can't be good for her. So I eventually, I managed to get caregivers for an hour in the morning and an hour in the evening to come in and help us with some of the cares for her. After I took my very big, scary-looking brother with me to all the meetings from that point on. And nobody was willing to argue with him, so I got what I needed. And that shows you really, though, that, most people don't have that, and you shouldn't have to have that to get the resources that you are allowed to have and eligible for. But it was a question of whose budget is she going to be in the hospital's budget or in the rest home's budget. They wanted to stick her in a rest home's budget, not their budget. Anyway, I got her home, and the very first day I'd studied this hyperbaric. I found access to one through a dive company of all places. And these amazing people had said, yes, we'll let you do it, sign a legal medical waiver that you take full responsibility, and we'll do that. So we did it. I took her down into this factory, and we stuck her on a forklift, and we had to stick her into this big chamber that looks like an LPG cylinder. And everyone thought we're nuts, this extremely fragile, amazingly sick lady. And here I am down at a factory sticking her in this big thing, and they all thought I was nuts. And but there was nothing else on offer, so I'm like, well, so we did 33 treatments there. And then she started to respond. She started to sort of wake up, and she didn't get up and walk or anything, but she was like trying to move her hands, and she was trying to say, and the odd word was coming out, and she was trying to communicate. And I could see that she was waking up, and there was a little bit of intelligence behind those eyes again. And so then I lost access to the chamber because it had to be taken off on a contract. And so then I researched, where the hell can I buy a hyperbaric chamber? And they're kind of like that, but not cheap. I mortgaged the house. I managed to buy one, mortgaged the house, installed it in our house, put it in, and started to put her through all these sessions day in, day out, sort of 5 days a week. And as I did that and she started to come back, then I started to study everything from, epigenetics and functional genomics and functional neurology, and how to get her vestibular system back working, and physio and keto diet and all these things for brain injury, and supplements galore, and, nootropics and everything. I was just like, study. And as she started to come back, we would hit brick walls, like, oh, now she's got drop foot. Oh, now she's got spasticity. Oh, now she's got, and as we'd have a little win, it would open up a new can of worms of things that she didn't have, things that weren't working. Like I didn't realize she had drop foot. The drop foot happens when you're in a bed for a long time and your feet are just down like this. And then I realized too late that I should have had her in a foot splint so that her feet weren't dropping forward. And so we're still dealing with the aftermath of that one. And I have to keep mobilizing her ankles and still. Anyway, long story short, it took me 2.5 years to bring her back to complete full health again. Thousands and thousands of hours of retraining her brain, hundreds of hyperbaric treatments, a really strict diet, exercise, all sorts of types of exercise, and vestibular and balance training and all this sort of thing. If I hadn't been an athlete and I hadn't known how to grind through training day in, day out without measuring results, if I hadn't known to how to push through limitations, and if I hadn't known to go against people telling me I can't do something, because then everyone's always been telling me, you can't do that, you can't run this, you can't run that, that's impossible, and I'm like, you just don't understand that the human body is capable of far more than what you think, and I can do this, and I did, and I have, and Mum will, and she did, and I found people who told me I could, and they would give me a piece of the puzzle, an expert in this area, an expert in that area. I studied under all these amazing scientists and experts. And that's when I really got into the podcast, and I selfishly got the best experts in the world on my podcast in order to teach my mum some new thing, and in the process ended up building this huge community of people that are learning alongside us, and so we managed to turn this whole lemon story into a lemonade story, basically. After, by 2.5 years in, she had full power of attorney back over her life, her full driver's license, which was in and of itself an incredible story. She walks 4Ks a day or so. She just got in from a walk, actually. She's just sitting over there in the lounge, in from her third walk today. Goes to the gym 5 days a week, goes to art classes, has a wonderful time with her granddaughter, all of these wonderful things, and has her full life back, and so we've written a book, which is called Relentless. This is the book here, How a Mother and Daughter Defied the Odds. So that's the third one that you've read. And it's really a book about, it's a story and all the stuff that we went through, but it's a book about mindset more than anything. It's got all the therapies and the biohacking and the technologies and the stuff that we came across en route. But it's a story about never giving up your power to anybody else. When it comes to your health or the health of your loved ones, and is taking control of your own health, being in the preventative space. It's about mindset. It's about, all these mental strategies to overcome the barriers. So I'm very passionate about getting that book out into the world, because it does, I get people writing to me, every couple of days there's someone writing to me about how that book helped them in their struggle, whether it was a medical struggle or whether it was a, just a life challenge that they were going through. And sometimes you can beat the odds. So yeah, it's a very powerful story.
Oh, it's absolutely incredible and very touching. And certainly, as you said, I have read the book, and one of my favorite parts of it was you were talking about running from one side of New Zealand basically to the other, and that you got overwhelmed on the first day sort of thinking about the feat of what you were going to try and achieve, and that your mum said just sort of put one foot in front of the other, just go from one telephone pole to the next. And I feel like it was incredible to kind of see that full circle of that headspace that you're having to take on in relation to then helping her.
Oh, I'm so impressed with you. You're just like, you've picked out the some really key things from all the research you've done, and reading the book's absolutely brilliant. You're absolutely amazing. Yes, exactly. And that is the full circle. It was my mum. I was running through New Zealand. I was running 2,250 Ks for charity, and I was standing at the start line having a panic attack, going, I can't do this. What the hell was I thinking? I can't run, and mum coming and grabbing me and giving me a big hug and calming me down, as mums do, and going, you don't have to run 2,250 today. You just have to go right now. Take that first step and head towards that power pole up there, is exactly what she said. Get through the first half an hour. Don't think about the rest. And that's been some of the greatest advice I've ever had. And I used that with her rehabilitation. I don't have to get her back to 100% today. I just have to keep her alive and moving forward, and taking that next thing on the list to do, that next training session. That's what I have to do right now. And that approach. And then getting up when there were times when I was just absolutely despairing, and months where there's no progress. And, I'd be coming home, I'd be bawling my eyes out. I'd be, my poor husband's shoulder got very wet very often. It was me crying away on his shoulder. But I would always get up the next morning and carry on. And that is what life's about. Get up again and go again, take another step.
So on a final note, Lisa, what does it mean to you to be human?
To me, it's about experiencing everything, and it's good and it's bad and it's ugly, and not living a life of comfort, but living a life of out there challenge, It's about succeeding and failing. It's about caring for one another. It's about learning from one another, having empathy for our fellow people on this planet, understanding that we're all just like here. I think, my spiritual beliefs, I'm not a religious person, but my belief is that we do have an afterlife, and, I can't prove that, but that's what I believe, and that we're here on a learning journey. We're here to learn some lessons, to develop, to evolve, to care for others, to do all these sort of things. And so when I get to the end of my days, I hope that I can look back and go, oh, I gave a good bloody crack, I made some big muck-ups along the way, no doubt, but I did some good stuff, and hopefully I'll leave the world in a better place than I could have otherwise left it. And that's the goal, I think, is to make sure that you left a positive legacy in balance, and that you try not to do harm to other people, and that you and to the world in general, which is easier said than done, but just living a life that is full bore, like love like there's, like you've never been hurt, and cry like, and laugh, and take on challenges, and fail spectacularly, and succeed spectacularly. I think those are the key things. And we get taught you're not allowed to fail, and you're not allowed to look bad, and it's bad. Don't embarrass yourself, and don't dishonor your family, and don't, I'm here at all, and I just don't agree with that. I think it's like, go hard, enjoy, fail, cry, get back up, learn, So I think that's what it means to be human for me.